I'm Jonathan Evans. I'm the archivist and curator at the Royal London Hospital Archives and Museum. I've been interested in the Elephant Man for many years. It's a sort of integral part of my job, really. But I'm particularly interested in the story, how it's evolved, how it's been retold over the years, who he was, what the hospital was like in those days, and also about the personality of Frederick Treves, the person who's principally responsible for communicating his story to the world. Joseph Carey Merrick, who's described in his birth certificate and death certificate and all hospital records as Joseph Merrick, was first described as John Merrick in Frederick Treves' 1923 Reminiscence. Treves wrote at the first instance with minimal corrections, but one correction he did make was that he wrote the word Joseph and then crossed it out, and he superlineated the name John. It seems he wanted to grant some degree of anonymity to Joseph Merrick. Most people around the world who know about the Elephant Man story think of him as John Merrick rather than Joseph Merrick. In a way, it kind of suits the kind of John Doe character, the everyman character that David Lynch in some ways portrays in the film. Joseph Merrick's time, particularly the East End of London, was a very densely populated area. Population by the early 20th century was actually approaching 600,000 in the immediate area around the London Hospital. Many of them were new to the area. In fact, many of them were new to Britain. There was a large number of immigrants, many people arriving from Russia and Eastern Europe, Central Europe, for the first time would arrive at the London docks and find homes. The East End of the 1880s was a turbulent time. There were strikes in the area at the time, but there were also other problems, social unrest and poverty particularly bad. There's also, of course, the Jack the Ripper murders, which were a particular feature of the East End in the latter part of 1888, when Joseph Merrick was in fact resident at the London Hospital. This again tended to concentrate the attention not just of London and Britain, but the world on the East End of London. I saw the film The Elephant Man when it was first released in this country in the late 1970s, and found it a very moving, powerful film then. It's an impression that stayed with me to this day. It's an interesting interpretation of the story, and it's largely based, I think, on two sources: the Reminiscence, The Elephant Man by Frederick Treves, which was published in 1923, and a book by Ashley Montague called The Elephant Man, A Study in Human Dignity, which was published in 1971. David Lynch takes those stories, but he also interprets them in his own way as well, for powerful dramatic effect. He changes the chronology of the historical events as they actually happened, and that's one of the most important aspects of how his interpretation is different from the real story of Joseph Merrick. Mrs. Merrick was Mary Jane Merrick, formerly Potterson, and she lived in Leicester with her husband. What we know about Joseph, that he went to school like other children, would have benefited from the education available in Leicester. I think he certainly attended a Sunday school, and he learnt to write and to read. And we have one example of his handwriting, which is a very nicely written letter to Mrs. Leah Maturin, who was a young widow. In the film, it's rather implied that Merrick's father had abandoned his mother. But in fact, we know that the family had lived reasonably prosperously in Leicester until Joseph's mother's death, and that Joseph's mother had died when he was about 7 years old. And he says that in his little autobiography that this was the greatest sadness of his life. And things really start to go wrong for him after that. We know that Merrick's father, Joseph Rockley Merrick, remarried, that he remarried his landlady, and that she wasn't very kind to Joseph, and that in fact he was obliged to seek his living hawking trinkets through the streets. As time went on, it became more and more difficult for him to make a living this way. His appearance became too unusual for him to be able to make a living door to door, and he tended to be mobbed and bothered by children in the streets. He eventually opted to enter the Leicester Workhouse voluntarily. It was whilst living at Leicester Workhouse that Joseph conceived the idea of being able to make some money out of his misfortunes. He wrote to Sam Torr. Now, Sam Torr was in the musical business in Leicester, and he had a popular music hall act at the time. Sam Torr involved a colleague of his, Sam Roper, and it was Sam Roper who first devised Joseph's travelling garb, which consisted of an opera cloak, loose slippers, loose-fitting and very large velvet yachting cap with a peak, and a veil which had just one eye slit. Joseph was met by Frederick Treves in the latter part of 1884, and he was examined by Frederick Treves in his rooms. He was presented as a case at a meeting of the Pathological Society of London in the December of 1884, and after that Joseph went on his way. In David Lynch's film, the chronology is different, and having come to the hospital and been accepted by the hospital as an inmate, and with the support of the readers and newspapers, a fund being established to look after him, he is once more effectively captured by the freak show proprietor, Bites, and is taken abroad and has a very unhappy time until he escapes and eventually finds his way home. The real story was that Joseph was much more in control of his own life and his own affairs. He'd had the idea originally of approaching freak show and music hall proprietors to try to make some money out of his unfortunate state. The tide of moral feeling about shows like his was rising in London at the time, and the police closed down the show. Joseph instead decided to try his luck elsewhere, and accompanied by a showman named Ferrari, Joseph travelled to Belgium. The show in Belgium was not particularly successful, and Ferrari abandoned Joseph, taking all his £50 savings. It had taken Joseph a couple of years to raise that £50, and of course the loss of the money left him devastated. Joseph would have caught the Ostend to Harwich ferry around 23rd of June 1886. He arrived at Liverpool Street Station on the morning of the 24th of June 1886. He was mobbed at the station. The police found him still with Frederick Treves' calling card in his pocket, and they brought him to the London hospital, and his admission to the hospital is entered in the London Hospital Patient Register dated 24th of June 1886. A lot of other aspects of the film that are historically accurate. The way that, for example, the receiving room or the accident department at the London Hospital is depicted is quite accurate. A lot of the hospital scenes seem quite accurate. There are lots of picture references, the makeup, for example, the uniform of the nurses, the costume, all of that is fairly accurate. The operating theatre scene probably isn't 100% accurate, and although Treves had some bad days when as many as 50% of his patients might not have survived an operation, by and large he was a successful surgeon, and he wrote a lot of surgical textbooks which remained in print for many years after his death.
Mr. Merrick, I have very great pleasure in being able to welcome you officially to the London Hospital. This morning the governing committee unanimously voted that you should be provided with these rooms on a permanent basis. This is your home now. I'm so very, very glad for you.
Welcome home, lad.
After about a year in the hospital, 2 rooms were converted for Joseph to live in. He had a bed-sitting room and a bathroom adjoining it. And the bathroom's significant, of course, because Frederick Treves tells us that Joseph had to have a bath every day. Otherwise, a noxious smell would come from fetid material gathering in his skin. In the film, the head of the nursing staff is played by a lady called Mrs. Mothershead. In reality, the head of the nursing staff was the matron Eva Luckers, who was only 26 years old when she was appointed in 1880. The nurses who looked after Joseph, well, we know about one in particular, and that's nurse Emma Ireland. Now, I've been able to trace that Emma Ireland was on duty in Cotton Ward, which was where Joseph lived when he was first admitted to the hospital in 1886. So the young actress who drops the tray, bringing up Joseph's supper to his room, I think is meant to portray Emma Ireland. The other characters in the film that are based on historical fact, well, one very prominent one, of course, is Francis Cargom, the hospital chairman, who's played by John Gielgud in the film. Now, Francis Cargom was chairman of the London Hospital during Joseph's lifetime, and he was indeed the person who wrote to the Times newspaper asking for subscriptions, which led to the establishment of the Merrick Fund, where £250 was subscribed by the readers of the Times, which allowed for Joseph to be maintained at the hospital. He presents the case of Joseph Merrick to the Hospital House Committee, who were in charge of the day-to-day running of the hospital, and he puts the case very powerfully, as portrayed in the minutes. He says that Joseph was a most unfortunate man who was destitute when he was brought to the hospital, and he had sought to have Joseph admitted at a hospital for incurables, but it hadn't been possible to secure him a place at the hospital for incurables. He was happy to receive, and in fact delighted in receiving visitors, and perhaps the first visitor that we know about, certainly in the film, is played by Anne Bancroft and is the actress Madge Kendall. Mrs. Kendall, named in the film, is a real figure. She was a real actress, and she and her husband were very successful on the London stage in the latter part of the 19th century. Joseph loved the theatre, of course, and the presentation of his going to the theatre in the film is quite a moving element.
Your Royal Highness, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance was very special to me because it was very special to someone else. A man who knows the theatre and who loves the theatre, and yet this is the very first time he's ever been here. I wish to dedicate, the whole company wishes to dedicate with all their hearts, tonight's performance to Mr. John Merrick, my very dear friend.
The character of Madge Kendall is important in the film. She becomes something of a mother to Joseph Merrick, and in fact at the final scenes of the film where Joseph lies down to sleep like other people, you see a portrait, a photograph of Joseph's mother on his mantelpiece, but perhaps even more prominently a photograph of Mrs. Kendall, which he describes as his most prized possession. As a mother figure to Joseph, she helps him to become to terms with his disabilities and to find some contentment. And this is an important aspect of the film as portrayed by David Lynch. Joseph liked to give presents. One of the presents that he gave has survived to this day, and it's a model church of German manufacture. And this he made for the actress Madge Kendall probably around 1886, when he was first resident at the hospital. One of Joseph's proudest possessions was a gentleman's dressing case, and he is described as using the dressing case and taking great pride in it to an almost pathetic degree by Frederick Treves. He was also given gifts by Princess Alexandra, who visited Joseph in his rooms at the London Hospital. Princess Alexandra comments in her own journal how touching she found her encounter with Joseph Merrick. One of the most memorable parts of David Lynch's film is the death of Joseph Merrick at the end of the film. And this echoes the scene as told by Treves in the 1923 Reminiscence, where Joseph wants to sleep like other people. In fact, he'd sustained his life up to that point by sleeping with his head resting on his knees, and because his head had grown so large, he would have suffered from great distress and even asphyxia if he tried to lie down to sleep like other people. It's important to see in the film that Joseph chooses to lie down to sleep, that he sees himself like other people, that he has been humanized by the kindness and love he's been shown. In fact, his death is a bit of an enigma, because we know that he was brought his lunch, that he was comfortable in the morning of the day of his death, and that he was found by doctors during the afternoon. It's interesting, and we know this from evidence produced at his inquest, that he was found lying across his bed, that he didn't tuck himself up in bed, but that it appears that he was trying to get up, that possibly he had a stroke or a mild heart attack or some kind of relapse, had fallen back and was unable to right himself. And his death certificate states that he died from asphyxia, that is suffocation caused by the weight of his head, and the causes of death are given as natural. Well, Joseph himself attributed his disease to a fright or an encounter his mother had with an elephant when she was heavily pregnant with him in 1862. And researchers have found out that, in fact, an elephant did escape from Womble's circus in Leicester about the time when she was pregnant with him, so it's possible she did have some kind of encounter. But that's not the reason that Joseph was suffering from the disease. We know that Joseph started to develop bony and fleshy tumours by about the age of 2. So it appears that Frederick Treves was right when he described the case as being one of congenital deformity. That is, that both Joseph and possibly also his sister were suffering from a disease that they were born with, perhaps a genetic defect. His sister was also, according to her death certificate, crippled from birth. It's been argued over the years as to what Joseph was actually suffering from. If you look at the inpatient register, compiled in 1886 for London hospital inpatients, it says that Joseph was suffering from elephantiasis. Elephantiasis is an inflammatory disease, an acquired disease. It's often something you find in tropical Africa and tropical countries. And it's certain that Joseph was not suffering from elephantiasis. There's good suspicion that Joseph might have been suffering from neurofibromatosis 1, possibly complicated by another disease, fibrous dysplasia. If you look at the X-rays and photographs of Joseph Merrick, there's lots of pathology shown, and if you look at different parts of the body, for example, looking at the femur, it looks a bit like he's got Paget's disease. In the 1980s, 2 American doctors came up with a new diagnosis. Tibbles and Cohen suggested that Joseph was suffering from a disease called the Proteus syndrome, a very, very rare genetic disorder, of which there's only a few cases described in the medical literature. That diagnosis has found favour, and there have been several attempts now to extract DNA from Joseph's remains to try to establish whether he in fact was suffering from Proteus syndrome, or whether he had neurofibromatosis, whether he had another disease entirely. But so far we haven't been able to establish exactly which disease he was suffering from. So it's almost possible to say, as one researcher has suggested, he was suffering from Merrick's disease.
Don't be frightened, he won't hurt you. He won't hurt you. He won't hurt you.
will feel the chill of horror. Yet this is not a horror story. You will feel the warmth of love. Yet this is not a love story. It is the shocking, true story of a very real monster who was also a very real human being.
Ladies and gentlemen, the terrible elephant man.
Man's a complete idiot. Pray to God he's an idiot. But supposing he's an intelligent man trapped in some monstrous body.
Where have you been? What did you do?
Please don't!
I know exactly what you've done to him, and he's never going back to that. Now, do you understand me?
He's a freak. That's how they live. We're partners, he and I.
Terrible though his appearance is, he is superior in intelligence. He can read and write, is quiet, gentle, not to say even refined in his mind.
Can you imagine the kind of life he must have had?
Yes, I think I can.
I don't believe so. No one could possibly imagine it. I don't believe any of us can.
Where is he?
I don't know what you mean, sir.
He's gone!
You're not listening to me! I ain't done nothing wrong. People pay money to see your monster, Mr. Trinks. I collect it.
You're the monster, you're the freak now, get up!
I am not an animal! I am a human being!
Anthony Hopkins, Anne Bancroft, John Gielgud, Wendy Hiller, and John Hurt as the Elephant Man. A shattering experience.
For the right price, you will see something you'll never, ever see again in your life.